Hey everyone, welcome to POPXP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the POPXP channel.
Good evening, everybody. Billy Tucci here, co-host of, one of the hosts of Crowdfunding Comics with my pal Niall Scala, Frank Amazing, and of course, Brian Blevins. And tonight we have a very, very special show for you. One that is very near and dear to my heart. A show about that brings us back to our childhood. And but before and talk about our love of cinema and our love of horror and the craft of filmmaking. And I'd like to introduce my co-host tonight, who is one of my very best friends from since the 7th grade, who we met and became friends due to our love of horror films. My co-host is Stephen Perros. He's a writer of film, TV, and theater, best known for writing Lionsgate's The Cat's Meow, starring Kirsten Dunst, for legendary director Peter Bogdanovich. As a horror film historian, he's done Blu-ray commentary tracks for Hammer Films, Hound of the Baskervilles with, of course, Christopher Lee, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte with Bette Davis, and The Mad Magician with Vincent Price. His acclaimed debut graphic novel, Stoker and Wells, is now on Indiegogo and has all the new exclusive perks for that. So without further ado or don't, one of my favorite people in the entire world, a man that I greatly admire in both his wit and intellect, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Stephen Perros. Hello, Stephen. Any idea?
Back. There I am.
Who's playing? Is Niall Scala back there playing? Is he the mad magician? Is he the man behind? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Well, it is great to be here, Billy, because, you know, we've wanted to do something ever since you launched Crowdfunding Comics, which is transformed over to POPXP. And Billy, you came to me and said, what about like we do like horror through the decades, horror films? And I know so many people love horror. You love horror because Billy knows I used to come into school back on Long Island with issues of Famous Monsters of Filmland, and Billy has credited me for introducing him to so much horror. I was just nonstop. My library is filled with books on horror and film, as you can see. My physical library of posters and memorabilia. So we started hashing this out and thought, why don't we do a monthly show and see if people like it? A century of horror. This is the first one that it's not going to be a decade. We're basically doing tonight the birth of cinema up until 1929. And then once a month, we'll do next month in September, we'll do the 1930s, then the 1940s, 50s, all the way up to the end of the last century. And we'll have a wonderful panelists like we have tonight, which we're so lucky to have. And without further ado, let's get some of them on the air. And first up, I would like to introduce Brian Polito. He's a 29-year comic book veteran and Inkpot award-winning writer, creator of Lady Death, La Muerta, Hell Witch, Purgatory, Chastity, and more. He's written or published, this is where his horror chops, and you see his love of horror, Nightmare on Elm Street, Chucky, Friday the 13th, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Halloween, among others. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, boys.
So now, how
I
did
got
you?
my beer and I'm ready to go.
Well, you know what? I'm gonna bring everyone on, and then we'll start chatting. Also from the world of comics, Graham Nolan, a 37-year comic book veteran, an Inkpot award-winning writer, artist, creator of Monster Island, Return to Monster Island, Joe Frankenstein, the Shinu and co-creator designer of the iconic Batman villain Bane. Welcome, Graham.
Good evening, gentlemen.
What's up, buddy?
I love how that Billy has discovered that amongst you, that you guys have in common, obviously, both the business and craft of comics, that you guys discovered about each other, your love, a sincere love, not just armchair love of all things horror, sci-fi, and fantasy. And I want to talk about how you guys discovered that about each other.
Sure.
But next up, let's introduce Justin Humphries. He is a writer, film historian, and curator. His latest book is the Rondo Award-winning The Dr. Phibes Companion, about the wonderful Vincent Price character. And his next book is George Pal, Man of Tomorrow, the first authorized biography of the great George Pal, who we'll learn more about when we do A Century of Science Fiction, leader of War of the Worlds, When Worlds Collide, and so many others. Justin Humphries, welcome.
Delighted to be here to talk about those great black and white scary German people.
And Swedish.
That's right. We got a Swede in there. We do. We got a Swede.
Two Swedes.
They got shit.
Ferndi, Ferndi, Kissender, Assender, Devlin.
You just read it backwards, right? Is that Swedish? You just read it backwards and you can understand it?
Goop, goop, goop. Just keep saying goop, goop, goop. You're set.
Don't trigger me, Justin. Okay, we have Perry Shields, a lifelong monster kid, actor and director who has portrayed, and I don't think any of you can say you know someone who has this distinction. He has portrayed Universal makeup legend Jack Pierce at conventions and industry events, and has been the theater MC at every Monsterpalooza, but one since 2010. For those who don't know, Monsterpalooza is the preeminent convention, as opposed to Comic-Con and so forth that mix comics and sci-fi and so forth. Monsterpalooza is really about film, and it's really about monsters. And while it encompasses so many decades, it's there's quite a lot of love for the classic era. And in addition to that, Perry currently teaches high school drama and film appreciation class in Los Angeles, where he keeps telling them, I'm telling you, silent films are great. So will you welcome Perry Shields to the show?
Thank you. I said that very thing today on my virtual classroom. No kidding.
So I want to just, Niall, if Stan Taffle is here, you could pop him in and I'll intro him. Otherwise, I don't want to intro him if he's still stuck in traffic on his way home.
Stan is not in yet.
Okay.
One of our other esteemed guests tonight.
All right. Well, they'll pop in when they pop in. Yeah. Well, welcome, gentlemen. One of the things that I have a memory of having grown up in New York, which was pre-cable, certainly pre-streaming, pre-VHS, is you watch things when they were on. TV shows that were the movies when they were on, they were like Halley's Comet, and you either caught it or you missed it. And everybody every monster kid knows that feeling of staying up at 11:30 to watch some movie. And then for some reason, God has this really wonderful trick, which is, yes, you'll sleep through all the most exciting stuff that happened. But when the tail credit music comes on, you wake up and you go, no! And I've missed this movie. I got to wait another 6 months to see this movie. So I remember, my experiences with silent film were in New York, PBS in New York. I didn't know how grainy and low res what I was watching was. But I fell in love with it on PBS in New York, watching classics. So I remember certainly watching Phantom of the Opera. I would probably say something like King of Kings, because they used to show that in New York around Easter time. And I had to argue with my parents because they actually showed a 3-strip Technicolor when he rises from the tomb. It was in color, and I tried to tell people upstairs because the TV was in the basement that I just saw a silent movie and there was color in it, and they were all looking at me going, "No, you didn't." They didn't have color in silent movies, and I couldn't convince anyone. So I'd love to know, you guys, what is your first memory of watching a silent film, and do you have that memory? Who wants to? Barry, how about you?
Yeah, sure. Well, I'll just play my cards right now. I'm 59 years old. I started collecting Black Hawk films around 1971. If any of you don't know Black Hawk films, they were a home movie distributor. Had the Hal Roach Library, Chaplin, tons of old silent films and some sound films. But my dad and I were in a dentist office waiting room looking through a magazine, and we saw a coupon for a free, not free, but it was like a, for $8.95, a sampler reel from Black Hawk Films. Standard 8 silent. Here it's kind of, sampler reel of what we have. So we were very excited. We ordered it, got it. It was about 10 minutes long, but it had scenes from all different genres. It had Chaplin, it had Keystone Cops, it had a little Hunchback of Notre Dame, it had a little Phantom. And the Phantom part is what really, I went, man, like I had known, like you, from Famous Monsters, all about these films, but I'd never seen it because in LA, you're right, you mentioned PBS. They were about the only station that would show silent films, and we didn't get PBS in good on our rooftop antenna. So that was kind of a moot point. Okay, it's on PBS, but I can't watch it. But I would say that Black Hawk sampler reel changed my life because then I became a film collector based on they made a lot of money for me.
Yep. Well, and it's amazing that you fell in love, that any of us fell in love with it, because most of the televised versions and even projected versions of silent film were not adjusted for 24 frames a second. For those of you who don't know in our audience, when films are silent, they, because of the economy, how many frames per second should go by the camera to emulate the appearance of movement. But we don't want to do any more because film's expensive. So they determined that 18 frames a second would show what human motion looked like. Cut to the late 20s when sound came in, and they realized, 18 frames a second, sound's not going to quite work as well. So we're going to raise the bar. We're going to make it 24 frames a second. The problem is that every time silent films were projected or shown on TV, they were shown at a 24 frame rate, which led to the cliche of people laughing at silent movies because everything is all sped up. Fortunately, in the age of digital, one of the many pluses for film history in the age of digital is that they've now, and all of the clips that we're going to show, and we're going to put into the show description the best, the highest quality, full length, feature length, free viewings of these on YouTube, and they've all been corrected and adjusted. That's why you'll see running times of some silent films are 63 minutes. Cut to someone does a proper restoration, and suddenly that same 63-minute film is 84 minutes. So that happened consistently. So yeah, it's amazing that we all are in love with it. Graham, how about yourself? What's your first exposure to silent film?
It was probably a Harold Lloyd on PBS. I never saw any of the silent horror films as a kid, but our PBS station did show some of the comedies, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, and I really like those. I'm going to be the contrarian here because I don't love silent horror movies, and when we get into it, I'll tell why. There's certain reasons, but I mean, some of them are good, but by and large, I don't love them. I prefer silent comedies over horror.
Well, that makes you a perfect guest for a show celebrating silent horror. Thank
Well, you can't have everybody on the same page. You need a contrarian.
He's going to be our expert when it comes to the Abbott and Costello horror films.
That's right. Yes. Brian, tell us about your first exposure to silent film.
It's funny. All you guys are reminding me of the days of PBS, WOR. I was a kid raised in New Jersey. And I think
New Yorker here.
Jersey. I was exposed to horror at a very early age by my mother. So I was born in 61, and I was probably in about 1965. I'm about 4 or 5. My mom introduced me to the first movie that I recall, which was The Hideous Sun Demon. Yeah, speed picture.
Robert Clark.
Yeah. And just a few years later, you know, as a monster kid, we'd be seeing stuff like the 4:30 movie, Chiller Theater, this sort of thing. But PBS would run these amazing, yeah, exactly. This guy.
Chiller Theater. Yeah.
With the extra finger.
PBS would run all this great stuff, whether it be Flash Gordon serials. But I do recall seeing The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, because what made it different was that the language of the movie, the mise en scène, let us say, was completely different from anything that I was thriving on at the time. Because with my mom, I'm watching cheapo horror films, you know, the Roger Corman stuff, Samuel Z. Arkoff, and then along comes an art horror film. So it was distinct. The consideration of art direction, the drama, the gravitas. So yeah, I think that was a paradigm shifter. The notion that like film could also be art. So there you go.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I asked Billy, you know, and Niall, our fine producer who's behind the scenes running this right now, to run that opening. That's literally the very opening image from F.W. Murnau's Faust, because so much of what we're going to be showing, you know, kind of breaks that cliche of if people only have an armchair understanding of silent film, this notion that it's proscenium and it's locked, and it certainly was for a certain period when it started. But that evolved very quickly, particularly thanks to the European influence and the German expressionist influence. But you watch that film Faust from beginning to end, and there's not one, shall we say, flat shot that looks like it's on a proscenium. Everything is cinematic, has depth, has movement, has creativity. It's just, it's a beautiful film. We're going to show some other clips as well, because we want to, part of why I loved starting with this show is just to really, really break that idea that that there's something old-fashioned about silent film. I'll tell you, I binged a whole bunch of movies I hadn't seen in a while, and a couple I'd never seen at all. This is all before what we know as the MPAA was then called the production code. This is before any codes, and it was not unusual to see nudity. It was not unusual to hear about taboo subjects. It's not unusual to see a scene of witchcraft or devil worship where a baby is tossed in a fire, for goodness sake. So anything goes, and often anything did. So it's exactly some of these films that caused there to be an uproar come the early 1930s. So, you know, Billy, how about yourself? Your first exposure to silent film?
I have to tell you what, my first exposure, and it's a double, is got to be, you know, I'm a huge fan of silent film, as you know, Steve, and I'm a huge Chaplin fan. And I guess being cartoonist, right, and Graham, perhaps you can, and Brian too, being with your storytelling background as a comic book writer, is you learn so much from silent film. We're taught that, of the storytelling, of how mobile the camera was. And it's almost like, especially that we're talking about these German films, the German expressionism, you know, expressionism, and that almost every single frame is like a painting. And it just really drew me in. And I have to say that Nosferatu really is the first horror film that silent horror film.
It used to be out in New York. Yeah, it used to be out in New York all the time. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I remember seeing it, and I remember when the Under Pressure video came out from when MTV first launched with Bowie and Queen, you know, and the scenes of, you know, Nosferatu pulling up and all, and it just terrified me. It really, I remember watching it as one of those late night showings, Steve, that again, I too would fall asleep and wake up at the end credits, but I would go back to school the next day and I would say that I saw the film. And I just remember this film, how it was so life-changing for me. It really was. And then doing research, and again, Steve, now I remember we had Steve and I grew up together in the same town. We probably grew up a half mile away from one another, but we went to different elementary schools. And my elementary school had one horror film comic, book that was always out. Yeah, and you had to get the librarian and kind of bribe him with an apple or something. It
was one of these two. It was either Great Monsters of the Movies,
I think that's what it was,
or Terrors from Screen to Screen.
Ed Naha, the great Ed Naha.
And what I loved about that is then I started to research it, And then I remember I read Dracula, I guess in 7th grade. We had to pick a novel or something. And oh my God, it was so long. I still don't know if I finished it, to be honest with you. But what I loved about that is that you had our first horror film from 1896, the Melies film, was 1896. The first horror film preceded the novel Dracula by a year, which came out. Stoker's Dracula came out in 1897. So the first horror film came out in 1896. But then again, the most used character, singular character in cinema history is the character Dracula. He appears in more films than any other character, you know, be it Robin Hood or whatever you would have, Jesus, you know, all these other, you know, Moses, whatever type of thing. And I just love the idea that again, horror films preceded the great horror novel.
Well, speaking of which, I want to just jump over to Justin. Justin, do you want to tell, share the history of Nosferatu and the ballsiness of director F.W. Murnau to make to just go ahead and make Dracula without actually contacting anybody?
Well, of course, Nosferatu was done completely disregarded. Was it Florence Stoker, Bram Stoker's widow, copyright, anything? Changed all the names of the characters and made like one of the best vampire movies ever made, if not the best. I mean, that movie's an absolute masterpiece. And you were talking, Billy, about paintings, that kind of painterly look that a lot of those films have. One of the reasons those movies are so strong, I think, is the reason that conversely a reason that a lot of newer movies, I think, are visually kind of weak. You know, so often you hear a director talking about a movie and they're just like, well, this was influenced by this, and this was influenced by this, and this was influenced by this. And it's like, no, I don't want cinema twice removed. Come up with your own visual language. And these guys like F.W. Murnau were drawing on art, you know, like you can see a lot of Caspar David Friedrich in Nosferatu. There's this powerful kind of phenomenology of the scenes by the seaside and such. Of course, one of the reasons, I mean, aside from Albin Grau, who was the production designer, co-producer, and who was actually an occultist. He was a member of the Fraternity of Saturn in Germany. Which I think were like vaguely based on Aleister Crowley's teachings. So there's a scene in the movie where the Count's looking at a piece of paper and there's actual alchemical symbols on it or something, Kabbalistic symbols. So it's really, there's that added dimension to it. I think one of the reasons that movie works so beautifully, aside from the fact it's a visual masterpiece, is Max Schreck. I mean, Max Schreck is Count Orlok. He's terrifying.
Billy, do you have a
Yes, I'm grabbing that right now. I'm going to, instead of covering over us, I'm actually going to open up a still. So please, Justin, just give me a second. Just follow up. I'm Niall Scholar.
Yeah, no,
so I'm going to grab the image. I'll grab an image for sure.
Not to hawk my own wares, but I will. This is my graphic novel, Stoker and Wells' Order of the Golden Dawn, where I did, obviously, in order to write a book about Stoker and Wells, I did a lot of research about Bram Stoker and about Dracula. And it's all about how these two men go on an adventure that inspires both Dracula and the Time Machine. But it's fascinating to see just what of Dracula and vampire lore is in the novel and how much we have cinema to thank and also theater to thank for what we believe was in the book, which wasn't. In the book, there is only the mention of Dracula not liking light, doesn't, but there's never a thing that if sunlight hits him, he'll disappear. That we have one and only person to thank, and that is F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu. Because he changed the ending of Dracula and had him perish by sunlight. And that was an interesting perish by sunlight, and which again did not actually happen and wasn't actually one of the things that's mentioned in the book, nor in vampire lore in general. So we have so much of what which is always amazing to me when you tell a vampire story, or a werewolf story, or a zombie story. You get fans and people saying, "Well, you know, that's not how it happens." As if these things exist and there is you know, everyone knows. It's like, no, everyone doesn't know that.
Wait, Steve, are you saying that fans are capable of petty quibbling? Are you saying they're capable of pettiness on an epic scale?
Artists and historians
Could such things be?
Can quibble as well, as we all know.
So is it Stoker's fault or Murnau's fault about giving us vampires that sparkle?
Well, you know,
neither. I think. I mean,
oh, thank God.
I will just say, we almost never saw this film because, in Florence Stoker's wisdom, I mean, obviously she's trying to protect her family, trying to protect her, she apparently got a note. She got a note from a friend saying, "Hey, I just saw a movie and it's basically your dead husband's book. You should really do something about this." And so she went after them. And the settlement was that the negative of Nosferatu was to be destroyed and all prints were to be destroyed. We are only lucky that the film even exists because all the prints that we have today come from where they come from. Somebody kept a print somewhere they found in a vault, 10, 20 years after Florence was long gone. And I guess all things were forgiven at that point. And everyone realized, shit, this is Murnau. We've got to save this movie.
I want to throw something in about my first exposure to silent films, and it involves Nosferatu. Even when I was growing up in the 80s and into the early 90s, it was like Steve said, you just had to eat what was put before you. You had to wait for the movies to come along and be screened. And my first exposure to the silence was maybe like Chaplin, I think, and the Chaney Phantom of the Opera and some other comedies. But I first knew these movies existed because of a book I saw as a kid called Movie Monsters and Their Masters by Robert Quackenbush, who's a prolific children's book writer and illustrator. And it literally, he's illustrating images from Der Golem, a Phantom of the Opera, Man Who Laughs, Nosferatu, all of these things. And I'm going, where are these movies where they look incredible? They look fantastic. I mean, I was depending on, whatever movie books were out there by Daniel Cohen or Thomas Aylesworth or Dennis Gifford's Pictorial History of the Horror Film or whatever. And it was a desert. It was a desert. You just had to rely on what you could find. And I remember when I finally saw Nosferatu on VHS, of course, it was a crappy transfer from a crappy 16 millimeter print. And it was still incredibly visually powerful. But I think, I don't know if kids realize now, they probably don't, how lucky they are to have these unbelievably sharp, unbelievably crisp, unbelievably good looking Blu-ray restorations of these movies. And also a friend of mine pointed out, one of the reasons the restorations look so good is because in the case of the German movies, they were using great lenses. They had really, really good lenses.
Nice lenses, yes.
So those films look gorgeous to begin with. I mean, you look at like the Kino Metropolis. It's like, Jesus Christ, parts of it look like they were shot last week. So it's unbelievable. We have a surplus of riches in terms of being able to see these films now.
And you could look at like Caligari, like a scene like that. Look at that. I mean, it's just extraordinary, and it's terrifying, and it holds up today. And again, as I was saying, and that's why I'm a little disturbed that Graham Nolan is not a fan of
we'll
silent
get to that. We're going to time it just perfectly.
All right, good.
But yeah, so we have obviously look in the dawn of cinema, the birth of cinema in the late 1800s. These are not feature length. People were, we have a cinema, as it were, although the word was probably not even used at that time, where people were just excited to see anything. A train coming into a station made people flee the theater because they thought, how could this be? There must be a train about to run me over. And that eventually gave way to story. But then you had Georges Méliès, who was this amazing French filmmaker, fantasy filmmaker, magician. And he brought, starting in the late 1800s, he began experiment. Trip to the Moon is in the sci-fi realm. But he also is credited with the earliest and first horror movies. And horror is defined by anything dealing with the supernatural. Because a lot of the horror movies, some of them aren't genuinely scary. Some of them are melodramas about death walking the earth, melodramas about the devil. So weren't necessarily looking to make you jump or make you terrified. But we group them in horror because of subject matter. Billy, did you want to show any bit of the Haunted Castle?
Yes, let's do that real quick because it's
I'm going to talk through it while it's on.
Yeah, give me a second, and I can mute it. I can mute myself.
Yeah.
And but give me a second. Let me share the screen. Again, I'm no Niall Scala.
And Billy, I want to say that you mentioned this was made before Dracula, and in this film you see a bat turn into a man, right? So even that whole concept.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's right. So let's grab that. Here we go. Full
I'll
screen.
tell you one of the fascinating things about George Melies, while Billy is queuing this up, you know, his sets were gorgeous. He played around with so many different special effects. He tended to shoot proscenium style, meaning it looked like you're looking at a stage. But one of the things that was an unexpected result was that Melies' films were so popular and so different from everything else that was being screened that he was being bootlegged, essentially. People were getting a hold of prints and making money off of his films, because here he is in Europe, and they were being shown in America. So what he would do at a certain point in his career, he said, I'm going to beat them at their game. I'm going to shoot my movies with 2 cameras next to each other. And when I'm wrapped, and when we cut it, I'm going to send my brother over to America with 1 negative, and go to the lab there, and I'm going to be here. So I'll distribute it in Europe. He'll distribute it in America. As a lot of people know, Melies, died a forgotten man, and he's a bit dramatized in Scorsese's Hugo. But he destroyed, all of his work, and so it was going to be lost. The good news was that there were these prints that were still in America. Now, what happened was somebody very recently realized, wow, when you took one of the prints from America and one of the few surviving prints from Europe, you realize they're slightly different because they were shot next to each other. Guess what? George Melies invented the 3D film, because they have since put them together, and you can actually watch George Melies in 3D, which is mind-blowing. I saw it here in LA. One of the great things about living in Los Angeles, they actually did that. They put together 2 existing European and American cuts of a George Melies film, and it's like you're watching a 3D stage production of a great fantasy piece. I'm getting a little bit of lag on Billy's video. This is not the greatest way to watch Melies, but this film is in our description, so any of you watching can certainly click on it and watch this. There, Jerry, the fella just disappeared. There's all sorts of fun stuff that goes on in this. Is it just me, or is it stuttering for all of you guys too?
Yeah, it's pretty laggy.
Stuttering. Yeah.
So Billy, I think we can pull this off.
I think your spiel about silent movies not being jerky just went out the window.
I wonder, Billy, do you think it's if I tried to share a screen with it, do you think that might do better? Niall, what do you think? Maybe not, Niall's not in listening distance anymore. Here we go. Let's see what I can do. If I can actually get this looking better on the StreamYard. Okay, hold on a second. Here we go. No, it doesn't look like it. Does it want to do it for me? Here we go. No, it doesn't. Doesn't seem to want to do it for me. All right. Well,
I'll throw out something about Melies as an old man. He was kind of looked after by the Cinémathèque Française, and one of the people who cared for him was Georges Franju, who went on to direct Eyes Without a Face and Judex and things. Great horror director in his own right.
That's much better.
That's much better.
Much better.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Billy, you were talking about the imagery of silent films, and I don't know if a lot of you guys know this, but during the 1960s, Stan Lee used to tell his artists to watch silent films because the acting style, that playing for the back row type of thing, was exactly what he was trying to teach people, and what they brought out in the book he did with Buscema, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. It's all that accentuated and dynamics of facial expression and stuff. So, and you can see that in these silent films. And it's every time I watch one now, all I can think of is Stan.
So here's that bat. Yeah.
Yep.
So again, these are tricks of the camera that people were not doing. Here we have a skeleton turning into a bat. You know, again, people were not anticipating and expecting camera movement. They weren't, certainly close-ups hadn't even been a consideration at this point. Right now, people were just sitting in a theater, essentially seeing an approximation of live theater without actually having to go to the live theater. So, you know, we have this, which is kind of interesting because film developed very rapidly once you get to the teens. And then the 20s, you have incredibly cinematic film. But then, as we'll find out when we do our show on the 1930s, the early 30s got static once again because the sound equipment was so cumbersome and noisy. So you get once again sort of very proscenium, boxy camera movement because people were so amazed that they were hearing something, hearing dialogue.
People talking into lamps because that's where they had to hide the mics.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Yep.
It's really interesting. You know, a lot of the really great directors of the sound era were that way because they had been trained in the silent era. I'm thinking like Hitchcock or Fritz Lang or John Ford or people like that because they understood visual storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to me, the best kind of filmmaking, and this is an old chestnut, but it's really true, is if you can cut the sound off and tell exactly what's going on.
Yep.
And it's something that that people are either born with or it takes them a very, very long time to learn. And
although I love that quote, I take slight umbrage with it when you get to movies like Network. You know, I mean, it is a Sidney Lumet celebrating dialogue. You know, on that, there's no movie. but I do agree with you. Yes, the theory behind that and why that is very important for directors to think: is the story? Am I making sure that the story is also being told visually, not just the talking heads? And I think you're absolutely right about that. I'd like to jump in and ask you guys about. We talked about first exposure to silent film. I want to talk about favorite silent films, and again, it doesn't have to be the film you think is the finest silent horror film ever made, but the one you think is favorite. I'll obviously save Graham Nolan for last because I don't know if he has one. We'll find out soon enough.
I got one.
But I do want to start because I do know the answer from one of our guests, and it'll wind up leading us to a clip. Actually, since we just showed a clip, I'm gonna actually maybe hold off on Brian and go to Perry. Perry, what is your favorite silent horror film, and why? More importantly.
Okay, well, I'm a huge Lon Chaney fan. So I think almost any silent Lon Chaney, well, they're all silent but one, but any 20s film with Lon Chaney has got a gem of a performance in it.
Yeah.
But I take umbrage at the label of horror film or him being a horror film actor. I think he was a character actor. Hunchback of Notre Dame is not a horror film, really. It's a historical fiction.
Yeah.
And the thing is, there's no supernatural element in Hunchback, Phantom, even London After Midnight, which we know the script of is a big cheat. He's not a real vampire in that movie. But I love The Unknown. The Unknown by Todd Browning is just such a disturbing. If you want to classify horror as something that creeps you out, or you feel like you clutch your body, like The Unknown makes me make sure like my arms are okay. Like that
is not a still from The Unknown, but it's a great story. Nevertheless.
There we go.
There we go.
You know, go ahead.
No, just the story is just so one of a kind. It's so unusual with Joan Crawford there, where Chaney is, a murderer hiding in the circus, pretending to be armless because he has a double thumb. There's all this deformity in this movie. He's got this dwarf assistant. I think his name's John George. He was in The Bells. He's in the Babes in Toyland. He shows up in a lot of films. But he, Chaney is in love with Joan Crawford, who has a phobia about being touched by men or being held by men. So he, I don't know if forgive me for being obvious with the plot. You guys are probably familiar with it, but he ends up getting his arms amputated, and it's just so. And then only to find out that she is overcome her phobia.
Yeah, it is total madness. And one of the things you see, especially with the German expressionist filmmakers and the European filmmakers, is how much madness is in silent horror, and why some of it is more melodrama than horror, but it's all about madness. I mean, when I describe, like you're saying, the plot of The Unknown is it just when you think it's gone as far off the wall it's going to go, it goes further. He Who Gets Slapped is another amazing Chaney performance.
Well, the penalty. Yeah. Oh my God, the penalty is just absolutely berserk. Where he plays an amputee crime lord named Blizzard, who has this hideout that's tricked out with all kinds of ladders and things. And at one point, a woman makes a bust of Lon as Satan. I mean, and that's only the beginning. I mean, it's just, those movies are so raw and vicious and berserk and intense and potent.
Yeah. No, and that goes through not just the Chaney films, but so many others. The Phantom Carriage by Victor Siostrom, Swedish director, right? Swedish, am I correct on that? Is that he's Swedish. Another incredible visualist, but madness in a weird way. It's the precursor to a lot of film noir dumb luck. You know, you never get a break. A lot of these characters, certainly Chaney never gets a freaking break in that movie.
No.
And pretty much in any movie he was in, he never got a break. But it's interesting you point out that they're not horror films. You know, Chaney's performances and the makeups, particularly in the two he's most known for, because a lot of his finest films are much better films than Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback of Notre Dame. What they are is great performances, time capsule performances in good movies. But they are not great necessarily. Those two in particular are not necessarily great works of filmmaking. They're impressive works physically of filmmaking, but they're not the films that He Who Gets Slapped or a lot of his Todd Browning, The Unknown,
west of Zanzibar. I mean, it's fantastic.
It's pretty well, and it's pretty well known that the director Rupert Julian of Phantom of the Opera was not a very good director. Chaney fought with him, and I don't think Chaney was really happy with the way that film came out. I think his makeup is far superior to the whole film itself.
Well, I think one of that. I think you're right. I also think one of the big contributors to that is Ben Carey, his art direction, which is just wonderful.
No, go ahead. I remember as a kid really being fascinated when Chaney went down and had that little straw and would go underneath the sewers, in the water in the sewers. That's an image that sticks with me from childhood. And I realized it's kind of a trick after a while, because they cut to something else, and they cut back, and it's just a straw. And like Chaney was not actually under the water in that moment, they were just putting a straw along. But they sell that gag so well. Billy, did you want to put up, or Niall, I should say, not Billy, did you want to put up that the clip from Phantom of the Opera? Is like, since we have some new fans to silent, hopefully new fans to silent film, we want to show one of Chaney's iconic moments. Oh, shall we keep chatting about Chaney till it comes up? Okay, we will.
Anybody? Well, I mean, also, Chaney had such a huge impact on like Ray Bradbury and Robert Bloch. I mean, they would go on and on and on and on and on about how those films affected them. And I think Guillermo del Toro today, we'll talk about him often.
Burt Lancaster used to remark on The Unknown and Chaney's performance in The Unknown and how much that affected him.
So, wow. Okay, here we go. Let's take a look at this here.
I think that's the most shocking scene in a silent horror film ever done. It still gets me.
Yep.
And still the way it's shot, the double shock of.
And here comes one of the great lines in silent horror: "Feast your eyes, glut your soul on my accursed ugliness." Spoiler
alert.
Well, I mean, we know he's ugly. Who cares?
I don't know. Can you have a spoiler on a movie that's 100 years old?
Yeah, good point. And here we have the great Mary Philbin, who also starred in Man Who Laughs, making her one of the very first movie scream queens and one of the greatest.
She lived a long life.
But look at these angles. Even here, again, defying the misconception of silent films always being shot per scene. And by 25 now, we're getting much more of the depth in the filmmaking, even a more workmanlike director like Rupert Julian. But
I think we're talking about these films not being supernatural in nature. They were setting up so many of the tropes that have continued on and on and on and on throughout the decades in horror, and one of them is the monsters as deeply sympathetic, tormented victims. They are the people that you sympathize with. And so often the kind of so-called normal human beings are the real monsters. And you feel such sympathy for these forsaken characters. I think particularly like Eric the Phantom or the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And I think more than any other, Gwynplaine in The Man Who Laughs, which is like one of the most sympathetic performances I've seen in film, period. One of the most moving, like deeply troubling and touching performances.
Well, yeah, I mean that's Paul Lenny, director who did The Man Who Laughs, Cat and the Canary, Waxworks, so many important and you The Man Who Laughs. Obviously, the comic book people in the room know just what importance that has. Anybody want to weigh in on that? And who that happens to look like?
Yeah. Jerry Robinson used his face for the Joker.
Yeah. Well, I think it's going back to how little information there was about this stuff and how inaccessible these movies were once upon a time. I've talked to other people about this that grew up loving these things, and we're like, well, when we were growing up, we didn't know that Gwynplaine was the hero of the film, that he's a likable guy because of growing up with the Joker. You just think he's this madman or whatever, but of course it's the complete opposite. So it was a real discovery when we finally were able to see the film.
And Justin, while we have you on, what is tell us what your favorite silent horror film is?
Okay, it's a cliche choice. I'm going to say it's a toss up between Nosferatu and Man Who Laughs. I think those two Nosferatu is such a film of incredible visual power. It's so striking. It's so eerie. Genuinely eerie, great feel for the supernatural. And of course, Max Schreck as Count Orlok is just unbelievably good. But The Man Who Laughs is not only, it's a beautifully made film, it's a beautifully directed film. Conrad, like I said, Conrad Veidt's performance is absolutely astounding. And the ending of that movie is still so affecting and so uplifting. I was talking to a guy the other day who went to a screening of it here in LA, and he said, at the end of the film, literally the audience was so worked up, they stood up and cheered. I mean, it's that powerful. And this is and this was probably 90 years after the film came out. I mean, it's an extraordinary film on every level. I love both of those a lot, but I think probably Man Who Laughs.
Conrad Veidt is like this star of horror cinema that isn't credited as being a horror star. I mean, you're talking about Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Hands of Orlak, and The Man Who Laughs. If people only know him as the commandant in Casablanca, they'd be shocked to know that he was this amazingly expressive, haunting figure for the camera of silent film. I mean, that face of his. I just watched the Hands of Orlak for the first time, directed by Robert Weine, who had directed him in Cabinet of Dr. Caligari many years later. It's, again, another one like The Unknown. It's just all about madness. These Germans, they were just so tapped into madness and knowing its value as part of cinema.
Of course, the interesting thing about German Expressionism in the cinema is that German Expressionism was not some hot new thing when it entered the cinema. It had already hadn't like run its course, but it was well into its cycle as an art form, as a popular art form. The cinema was one of the last vestiges of it, and it was all about externalizing internal spaces, which I think goes to its outermost extreme with Dr. Caligari, and these very figurative, very very personal visions of things. But yeah, it's funny. Orson Welles really didn't like Caligari. He gave it a hard time. And I remember him saying that he was like, they're always reviving this film. I don't get it at all. He's like, I think it's very, very just crazy for craziness' sake and so forth. But again, I mean, the primacy of the images in these movies, you don't forget these images. Yeah. You don't forget I'll tell you another great shock moment. Graham, I agree with you about Eric, but one of the moments that Eric's unmasking, but one of the moments that gets me to this day is where Dr. Caligari opens the coffin and you see there's that extreme close-up on Conrad Veidt and his eyes open and he gets this look like he is a rabid animal about to rip your throat out. and it's so powerful and so intense, and it still kind of freaks me out, which is great. I mean, it's they're such visually powerful films.
Before we get to the one of the showstopper clips and Brian Polito's favorite film, I'd like Graham to speak a little bit. I'm sure you have one that's more desirable than others in the horror arena.
Mm-hmm. You know, a lot of these things, we talk about imagery, and the problem I have with a lot of these films is that it is a collection of great imagery, and the pacing on them, particularly like Jekyll and Hyde, the pacing on that is so slow. The other one was Caligari. That's another one that I find unbelievably slow. But when they do get it right, and you get a director who knows how to pace the story, like the Phantom Carriage, that movie is it looks like it was made in the 2000s with the subject matter that it covers.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It owes as much to what's the word? Christmas Carol.
I totally was thinking that this week. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
You know, it's very much in that vein, but then it also touches on redemption, and the scene where the guy who's supposed to take over as the new driver of the Phantom Carriage, I can't remember the character's name, when he is watching the wife that he has just been the biggest shit to his whole life, is about to poison herself and her children. I mean, that scene is unbelievable.
Yeah.
The actor and his passion and his pleading, it sort of hit me the same way as that scene in Saving Private Ryan, where the Jewish soldier is fighting with the Nazi up in the apartment, and they're going at it, and he realizes he's going to die because the Nazi's got the bayonet on him, and he's pressing it into him slowly, and he's begging for his life. No, like that.
Yeah.
It had the same kind of power as a modern sound film did. So,
and that was Victor Siostrom. That's actually the director in that role. You know, as an actor, he not only obviously stars in his own film here, but he was later pulled out of retirement by a director by the name of Ingmar Bergman and wound up starring as an old man in Wild Strawberries.
He directed Lon Chaney in America.
Yeah, he was
a big influence. I think the Phantom Carriage, as I recall, was a big influence on Bergman, and you can sort of see echoes of it. You can see echoes of it in like Seventh Seal and stuff like that. But Siostrom was a very big deal in the Swedish cinema.
Wasn't he brought over to he directed the very wasn't He Would Get Slapped, the first official film from the banner of MGM, and I think so. I think he brought over Siostrom to direct that and The Wind with Lillian Gish. Quite a beautiful and intelligent. He was kind of he kind of had it all, because he was both artistic, but he also wanted scripts that were rich. As Graham pointed out, what's really great here is the story has depth. It has a richness to it. One of the reasons I think people don't talk as much about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the Barrymore Jekyll and Hyde, is for the very reason you're saying. It's a terrific performance. Very obviously physical transformation in a film that's still a little bit, even though it's 1920, feels a little bit more like 1913 or 14. It's a little bogged down in proscenium, and what we really take away from that film is the Barrymore performance. But I really
too.
Yes, yeah. But
that egg-shaped head that they gave him, and then the extended fingers, when he puts it up to his face. That stuff is great. In fact, I had to fast forward through to get to that point because there were some points where people were just walking around, talking, and not even talking. It's like, come on, man.
Yeah.
But by the way, another thing people keep bringing up about Phantom Carriage is the part where he's hacking away at the door, and the girl's got the wife's got the kid, and everyone's like, oh, this is just like Shining. I mean, I can easily see Kubrick having seen that, but it's I don't know if he did, but I mean, actually, I prefer the Phantom Carriage to The Shining. So sue me.
Thank you. Same.
So do I.
Same
Yeah,
here.
I mean, I think the Phantom Carriage works every bit as well today as it did back then.
Oh yeah,
I think
and
a lot of them do. I think Man Who Laughs definitely does, and Nosferatu, and
I saw
The Unknown. The Unknown. I mean, there was a film professor at School of Visual Arts in New York for years named Gene Stavis. He's gone now. He was great. And at Halloween, he would screen The Unknown for his students, and it was. I mean, they're just jolted. It's like they're not prepared for silent movies to be that affecting and that intense and that good. So
I was prepared to think that Faust was going to be the best one as I started watching some of these ones I hadn't seen before. And I walked away so disappointed in that movie because it didn't know what it wanted to be. It starts off as German expressionism, and that opening and those sequences are absolutely amazing when he releases the plague and all that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then it dives into almost like a situation comedy where it gets very light, where even Mephisto becomes somewhat of a likable character. And then it goes completely Wagnerian and is just heartbreaking with the girl and the pregnancy and all that kind of stuff. So it's like it didn't know what it wanted to be.
I disagree. I strongly disagree with that. I mean, I think, for instance, of like Julius Caesar, one of my favorite things about the 50s Julius Caesar with Marlon Brando is you have Edmund O'Brien as Casca doing comedy. I mean, it's a tragedy, but there is comic relief. And I think Emil Jannings is wonderful in his comic scenes as the devil. And it's very similar to what they did with like Walter Houston as the devil and Daniel Webster. So I strongly disagree on that point.
Well, John Ford used to do that. He would insert comedy like in films like The Searchers. But when a lot of times what that does is it really jumps out at you. It's like, oh, here's the comedy scene. And it loses.
I agree. I agree when the comedy doesn't work. Like I will say, one of the saddest things in revisiting like Cat and the Canary and 7 Footprints to Satan is that they, as visually stunning as those films are, and they are visually stunning, they set up a horrible tendency that continued into horror films in the 30s and 40s and especially in the 30s. Where they would add in comic relief that's neither comic nor a relief. All of those stupid, awful characters that show up in the wonderful Universal monster movies. Oh, Fly, let's go get him. You're not fucking funny. Stop it. It's like, just get out of the movie. Let's see the monsters, you know?
Right. 7 Footprints to Satan, yeah. 7 Footprints to Satan is no way a horror film, really.
Yeah.
Visually it is, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's amazing how quickly filmmaking spoofed itself and served itself up. You know, they started spoofing haunted house movies long before the sound era even came in. Yeah. You know, which is kind of fascinating how fast Hollywood became aware of itself. You know, they even spoofed. You know, when you get to the 30s, they even spoofed kid getting off the bus, Star is Born stories. You know, as soon as they started making them seriously, they were spoofing them. So it's Hollywood was always very. And I think that's where the haunted house humorous movies came in, which of course was crystallized in a perfect balance when we get to our 30s episode, which will be The Old Dark House, which is an amazing film. But you know, a lot of the classic 30s, you see a lot of roots in the 20s. They're obviously some of the same artists worked on films from the 20s to the 30s, and some were just influenced. A couple of stories after I watched The Magician, a film very little spoken about by director Max Ingram, and I'm watching it thinking, oh wow, this has a lot of Frankenstein and a lot of Mad Doctor. This could very well be the same shot of the castle in Bride of Frankenstein, the explosion at the end.
He even holds onto a lever at one point.
There's a lot of that. A lot of the German expressionism was carried over in a kind of like I use the word diluted form. But not in a condescending or pejorative sense. It was just the look got in.
This is a beautiful. This sequence is one of the things where, you know, in The Magician, he's a hypnotist who played the Golem, Paul Wegener. He's in a dream state with her where he's hypnotized her, and she's got this funk. I'm glad you get this funky sequence with this Pan-like creature. No, this is actually the best scene in the movie. They got this dancer to come along and be obviously the god of sexual desire running around the heroine.
So you got the 7 Faces of Dr. Lowe action here.
Yeah.
But this very much influenced Dante's Inferno. That came
in the
in the
background.
30s.
We had that middle Matrix movie where they had that weird club scene.
Mm-hmm. But this is totally the Lugosi movie that doesn't star Lugosi. This is totally the Raven with he and Karloff. Every Mad Doctor Lugosi ever played, every Mad Doctor George Zucco or anybody else played in the 30s and 40s kind of started right here in this movie. So you see all this groundwork of the shoulders upon which 30s and 40s cinema was built but these films were very dormant, and I think I'm correct in saying that, Justin, because they weren't re-screening silent movies in the 30s and 40s. That was a dead art form. Sound was in. No one wanted to show silent movies.
No, that's true. I think they would have probably been revived for like film clubs and things like that. And I know they would have been running them at, say, like the Cinémathèque Française in France, or maybe I think the Museum of Modern Art. They were. It was something that specialists and people that were really interested in it would see. But I know they would have revivals of like Chaplin's Silence, of Harold Lloyd's. But as far as the horror movies and stuff are concerned, no, they were sort of pushed to the wayside. And I think the real resurgence of interest in them, I think, came along with the monster craze in the late 50s and into the 60s, and among hardcore cineasts like William K. Everson, guys that were really studying this hard. We're like, well, wait, where did this movie go, or where did that movie go, or whatever? And you can go. Yep. Yeah. Those books were our Bibles. I mean, those early books, they were virtually all you had. And to see good, clear photos from those films, and to hear people that could write well and were knowledgeable and enthusiastic about it, talking about them was a revelation.
And some of it was just, a lot of the artists. Beautiful! I love it.
Oh yeah,
I love it.
You're in the New York area. You've probably seen this.
Of course. So I mean, and what's interesting also is so many died in the transition, right? Obviously, the obvious is Lon Chaney, who dies in 1930, just at the dawn of the sound era. But you have Murnau, F.W. Murnau, who directed Nosferatu, Faust, the great drama, one of the greatest films of all time, Sunrise. And he dies at 42, writing down PCH, in the early 1930s. Then you have Paul Lenny, who we talked about, Man Who Laughs, Cat in the Canary Waxworks, dies at 44 of complications from a tooth infection. Then you have Robert Weine, who just never made something as exciting as his silent films. He made films well after Caligari and Hands of Orlac. But nothing of particular note once the sound era came.
Well, and then one of the only ones of these guys we're talking about, these directors whose work I'm talking about, that really, really kept going and going and going, was Todd Browning. Of course, until Freaks just destroyed his career, it was considered so vulgar and so awful. And I cataloged a lot of Todd Browning's estate, and in one of his scrapbooks, he had saved what was probably the most vicious review of Freaks from, I think, Variety. It was like, leaves a brown taste in your mouth, whatever that means. And it was not just trashed. It was like, they just thermonuclear bombed it. His career was over. But here's the thing: Browning was wealthy. He was not earning for money. He lived in Malibu when it was just a little rustic community, and he lived there until he died in, what was it, like 63, something like that. And he was just a mean old recluse, basically, with a few friends.
Well, but for those who don't know, this is ultimately the director of Dracula as well, and about 6 or 7 Chaney movies from the 20s.
Yeah, well, a lot of horror movies, crime movies.
But isn't it true that he was sort of banished? He was living in sort of this beautiful, idyllic beachside prison because didn't Louis B. Mayer say, "I'm going to keep you under contract and I'm never going to use you," because he was so upset with Freaks?
That I don't know, but I can believe it. Believe it. Freaks just. It was the same thing that happened to Michael Powell with Peeping Tom. It was just like, you look back on the movie and you're like, well, this is actually a really good movie, and it's actually really sympathetic. It's deeply sympathetic to the human oddities in it. But there was he just didn't direct again. As far as I know, he wasn't giving interviews.
Well, you know, the term horror film didn't really exist in the 20s. I'm not sure when it was first coined, but because of that which is horrific, you would often get scathing reviews of films that are now classics, because as far as they knew, you know, we were going to see a drama, a melodrama, and when you got into the thing that we now call horror, to a lot of critics at the time, the filmmakers and the studio had crossed the line. And this is lurid, and this is disgusting, and this should be, you know, tossed aside, and how could they have stooped this low? So you saw a lot of that in a lot of the critical reception of films of the teens and 20s that we now call horror, because they hadn't figured out a word for it yet. A genre.
Yeah, and also there was a lot of community backlash, you know, from religious organizations and so forth, well before, you know, the Hays Code and all that, the production code. Because I think a lot of people were, I mean, these movies we look at now and are like, wow, that's really kind of like, that's shocking for a silent movie, or that's shocking for an early sound movie or a pre-code movie. Imagine how shocking it was to some yokel in Utah.
Sure.
You know, on Saturday night before he was going to the prayer meeting the next morning. Yeah. You know, a lot of people considered these movies, you know, salacious and awful, and these things that were kind of risque in them, they thought were really sinful and so forth. So yeah. And the end of Freaks, my God. I mean, you talk about another.
Let's
not go too much. We're going to be talking about that in 1930s. But speaking of a clip that we want to watch, that we're all excited to share with viewers who are not been exposed, Brian Polito, will you please tell us about your favorite silent horror film?
Well, you know, like a lot of us this evening, I'm just a voracious fan of cinema and horror in particular. So what's fun is to try to find that delectable film that you've heard about, but you never quite got a chance to see. And I think it really wasn't that long ago, maybe 10, 15 years, I finally got to see the film that we're going to show a clip of, called HAXAN, Witchcraft Through the Ages. And the reason I adore this film is because it's a very wonderfully realized perception of hell and sin, maybe from the Middle Ages, finally brought to life. Paradise Lost, paintings of Bosch, finally brought to life. And some of the things that I adore about it is that it's unrepentant, it's blasphemous, it's just really all over the map. And if you haven't had a chance to see it, it really is a treat. So, you know, as evidenced by this wonderful.
Yeah, you know, what's fascinating is when I first was exposed to this film, it was in a truncated form, and we were all just fascinated to see it even in its truncated form. I mean, look at this crazy demon crawling up this woman in bed. And then it fade out before you could even see what it is. No, it's just all the torments of hell just suddenly come out in this motion picture. But they truncated this, what is really an hour and 47-minute film, into sort of a 63-minute best of sort of version. So it was fascinating for me to revisit it in HD online streaming, and we have the link here for people who want to watch it. This glorious version of this film kind of goes through different chapters of witchcraft and Satan's influence, and how man struggles against it, both in medieval times and also up to the present. And it's the gift that keeps on giving this film. It just never seems to stop. Of course, now here we're seeing partial nudity, which you would never see in a film in the 1930s. The reins were certainly pulled back on this. Here's a woman slumbering in the same bed with her husband, which was gone for several decades in American cinema, only to be coaxed by the devil, who's at her window saying, "Come on, I want you." And she just gives a little sigh. She's already having Lord.
My God.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of films this is definitely non-narrative sometimes, and it's pieces of things, but it's just a crazy celebration of sin
Mhm.
You know, the devil is a low SOB, Jack. Look at that, man.
That's right.
That's awful. Look
Well, I'll
at
tell
that.
you,
Look at that. It's Jerry Falwell Jr. right there.
I mean, the devil on Earth was a big theme in 20s horror. Death walking the earth was not only in the Phantom Carriage, but also in Fritz Lang's Destiny, which is another film filled with striking visuals. There's these beautiful, sort of very clean stories. A man comes to town and buys the property of the side of a cemetery, and then he builds a wall all around it, and there's this glorious shot of this little tiny man sitting on a bench in front of the giant wall he's built around basically death. I mean, this glory, but it's fascinating to see madness, death, and the devil are sort of something you see continuously running through silent film horror.
If I may, this film really heralded the Roaring '20s. Because if you look at all the films we've been talking about, the German films, and you look at what Germany was ravaged by the First World War.
World War One, yeah.
You know, I mean, ravaged. Millions of men, and I mean, the wars took place basically in Belgium, in Eastern France, and in Germany, the entire war. And then Germany, of course, was forced to pay all the repercussions of this war. Then all of a sudden you have the influenza outbreak. And here are these people, like I said, with the German Expressionism, with the art and all, and you look at those earlier films and just the pain that goes through and the fearlessness. Then you come to something like HAXAN, which I believe is a Danish film, right, or a Swedish film?
Yeah, Danish.
Danish film, and they weren't really directly involved in the war, but now we've beat influenza to a certain extent.
Yeah,
I
want to talk about this film. Yep.
You see the influenza outbreak then comes to the United States with Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. You see the now it's come to the United States even through sea travel, obviously, and now you have this outbreak in the United States. But this picture right here is just
this is a movie, Genuine, which is the film the director of Caligari did almost immediately after, and this is about any movie that ever came about a female vampire or non-vampire that has a hold on every man who she comes in. I mean, you basically, this film, you see the roots of 1982, 80, I think it's, no, not 82, 86's Life Force in this film. This is a vampire who is able to seduce any man who she comes in contact with. And obviously vampire vamp, this was all something that started to be coined in the 20s. Speaking of coined in the 20s, I'd like to quickly introduce a man stuck in time and stuck in traffic. Let me introduce Stan Taffle.
Stan
Is a 3-time Emmy Award-winning actor, but he is also a motion picture and television archivist and historian who's always reaching for a better Wi-Fi connection. He's the president of the Cinecon Classic Film Festival, which is the nation's longest-running classic motion picture festival, often specializing in 20s and 30s films, which is going to be held for the first time virtually next week at cinecon.org, and you'll see that in the it's cinecon.org. And this is a pricey convention if you go the normal way at the Egyptian, but thanks to the blessings of Stan Taffle, we will be seeing it for all these great finds that Stan has found. Films you'll only see in this form thanks to him. Stan, welcome very late to the show.
Well, I had to wait for the sun to come down. Boy, oh boy, I'm happy to be here. Welcome to LA, the way it used to be.
Yeah,
yeah,
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Are you talking circa 1915 LA?
Oh, yeah. Well, unbelievable. I mean, this should have taken 2.5 hours, and it took 4.5 hours. And we thought it would be fine. It's never been that terrible until before the pandemic, but happy to be here. I'm sorry that I missed. I feel like maybe you've already started talking about the 1960s. I feel like I was so late.
One of the things we're going to do, and now we're going to kind of wind down to the last maybe 12 minutes, see if we can keep this at 90 minutes, get some questions from the comments. And I'm glad you weren't here, Stan, because I'm sure between me and Justin and the rest, we said a whole bunch of incorrect facts about silent cinema that you could have corrected us on.
Oh, wow.
Include me out.
So, so Niall, are you actually there? Are you finding questions? Did Billy and I look
Yeah,
around?
I got them. I see them. I have a question though for Brian Polito.
Yeah.
Brian,
Yes.
you see that you watch HAXAN, and I'm new to that film. Maybe 5 years ago I watched it. You said maybe 10 years ago you discovered it. For those of you out there that are film people, are not comic people, Brian Polito is one of the most successful independent publishers, writers, creators, world builder, empire builders in comics history. Now, Brian, with your character Lady Death, I've noticed the last, say, let's go 7 years of Coffin Comics. You've put together with your Lady Death and your 48-page graphic novellas, you've put together these epics that when I revisited HAXAN today or the other day, I watched it, I just see this, and you just go over the top with all this stuff. Has this film that you discovered it, I believe you said you discovered it maybe a decade ago or so, did that influence the new Lady Death stories? Not that saying Lady Death was never small, but it was more personal in the early stories. But now you have these grand, and I don't know how he does it, Graham. He creates these the King of Kings, the intolerance within 48 pages of a comic, which is unlike the film. Has a film like that, and being at the again, as us as comic book creators, we're almost like silent film directors, because we have dialogue, of course, but maybe our dialogue are our little caption boxes, our little cinder breaks, but it's mostly a visual thing. Has that influenced you in a storytelling wise? Because a film like HAXAN, which is so my God, it's a gigantic debauchery epic of, like you said, sin and just debauchery, monstrosity, whatever. Has that film influenced your writing style as a comic creator?
Well, I got to tell you, with the milieu of Lady Death, we are frequently dealing with issues of a sword-wielding battle maiden who fights evil in hell or anywhere. And seeing HAXAN really fermented a lot of imagery that I recall from reading things like Paradise Lost or seeing the paintings of Bosch. And to see it all in one spot, there's no doubt there's an influence. I'm definitely consuming all that kind of stuff. But also, to answer you on that whole idea of like going super epic in a 48-page comic, one of the reasons why I like to do that is because the form allows it. Here we are today celebrating the birthday of the king, Jack Kirby, an incredible world builder himself, like the man, the template. This guy would, just on a double-page spread, for someone to bring that to life, like what do they call the Promethean giants, these planetary-sized creatures that are at the edge of the universe, strapped to giant rocks. I mean, that the idea comics can do this kind of stuff, so why not? So, and then to be able to keep scaling it, and the particular issues that I'm dealing with, HAXAN really does come in handy. So thank you for that.
Rob Kotecki, interesting.
I got it, Stephen. I saw it.
Yep. But I also just want to back up. Heroinberg, who also posted Stan Taffle's Cinecon information here, pointed out that apparently the term horror film was not used until the 1930s when Universal coined it for their pictures. Stan Taffle, would you agree with that?
Oh, wholeheartedly. No one thought that Nosferatu was a horror film.
Yeah.
They didn't know what to call it.
We talked about that when you were late.
Oh, you probably talked about everything when I was late.
Well, we talked about we didn't know when it came in, but we knew it wasn't around during the 20s. But do you think it was coined by Universal in the 30s?
Yeah, I think it was. I have not seen any evidence that it was in the silent era, even though it's certainly clear when you look at the films of Paul Lenny, whom I adore, Cat and the Canary and The Last Warning. You can see definitely that those were influential to the early 30s Universal directors.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, that question by Rob Kotecki, which silent horror flick is most influential on the modern era? For some reason, my mind went to Metropolis, which isn't horror, because I certainly think Metropolis never stops influencing science fiction, whether it's Blade Runner, whether it's Matrix, whether it's so many films, even when they don't know they're borrowing from it, they have, because they're borrowing from someone who borrowed from it. But horror, what horror do we feel is most influential in the modern era? Anybody have any knee-jerk reaction? Again, it could be people don't even know that they are influenced by it because, they've been diluted through several different impersonations over the years.
Well,
Wait,
go ahead.
Perry?
Oh, sorry. I was just saying. I mean, this might be a little tangential, but the longest running show in Broadway history, longest running musical, is the Phantom of the Opera. So you want to talk about, and that largely follows the narrative of the 25 film.
Absolutely.
There's a huge influence right there, even though that's of course not a horror film, but
even with even with the play with the Broadway play, is that you look at Chaney's performance and the scene. Remember when Christine pulls off the mat, pulls out, and at first the horror and him coming towards you, and then you see Chaney's humanity pouring through that makeup, that 3 hours of makeup that he applied. He still comes through, and you just feel awful for him. You feel that what kind of life does someone have that leads him to a point like this? Whatever, no matter what a creative genius he is or whatever, but it's just heartbreaking. And that's why when Debbie and I, my wife and I, were in college, and her godmother, her Aunt Steffi, our Aunt Steffi, took us to see Phantom. And I think it was 88, and we saw, and Michael Crawford was still in the role of Phantom.
Yeah.
What's her name? The
Sarah Brightman.
Yeah. She was not there. She was gone. But Michael Crichton was still there. And I remember the heartbreak of him. And I'm like, this was Chaney's Phantom. And I remember trying to explain to them, because I think we went to Serendipity to get ice cream or something, if you guys remember that place in New York. And of course they didn't get it at all. And I'm like, this is Chaney. This is all Chaney.
Well, it's interesting, right? Because when you think of the box office success of Phantom of the Opera and Hunchback of Notre Dame, and that they are about the sympathetic monster, and now Broadway revives it, and it shows that the sympathetic monster still will always find an audience of men and women. You roll that into Disney animation, you roll that into so much, so you really see, even for the people who don't know that they're emulating with the beginnings, that they're standing on the shoulders of silent film, they are.
Right.
They're ultimately standing
I think the Broadway Phantom owes more to the Claude Rains version.
Oh, you think so? I don't think so.
No.
Doesn't have the horrific face that's described by the author in the book, that kind of skull-like face. This is just a guy who's a handsome guy who's got a little acid problem on one side.
But I think but the thing with the 25 Phantom is that you see that she is so drawn to him that she falls in love with him as who he is, as opposed to how he looks.
Right.
Well,
Billy, like you said,
that's not part of the Chaney version. I mean, when you get to interestingly, there really hasn't been a perfect film version of Phantom of the Opera, of the story.
No, I agree.
Not the Chaney version. Not as a kid, I couldn't stand all the singing in the Claude Rains version, and the Hammer film version has no third act, and it just kind of stops when it should be starting. But they all have beautiful moments. They all have great visual power and performances. And if anything, I feel like the Crawford has a lot in common with the Hammer film. But that also has a lot of common, wherein there's actually scenes and dialogue and empathy between Phantom and Christine, which isn't necessarily found so much in the Chaney, but
I want to give a little love to Phantom of the Paradise. Easily my favorite version of Phantom of the Opera. I love that movie. And there's that whole what is it? Somebody Super Like You number that's all built to look like, by Jack Fisk, to look like Caligari. So they're well aware of.
Niall, somebody's microphone is clicking and clicking. Can you see who? Oh, it's done. Okay, good. It's over. Whatever it is, it's over. Any other? What else do we have going on question-wise in the chat?
No, we're just getting people are digging the panel. They're just digging it. I think we're all really. Jem Mint, what's up, Jem Mint? Good to see you, buddy. I think this is a terrific. What?
Billy, I want to know what
Francisco Polito. It's a black Cavendish, and it goes well with a Robert Mondavi private selection, if I may. My bourbon barrel aged cab.
Very nice.
You know what we haven't mentioned, and we just had a clip of it a minute or two ago, is the Edison 1910 Frankenstein.
Right.
Yes.
Charles Ogle as the monster.
Yes.
It is everything you expect from a 1910 silent movie. But there's one sequence that's really primitive but so effective, and that's the creation of the monster.
Yes.
The puppet of the monster set fire to it and then reversed it, so it's building itself up. And it's very primitive, but it's so weird and otherworldly and effective, like in the strangest way. It's really ingenious.
Mm-hmm. If someone's microphone is making a lot of noise, if you can mute yourself until you speak, that's a beautiful thing. Whoever just did that. Yeah, I mean, it's gloriously simple effects, but it's so powerful. They just basically reversed burning down this. Now, mind you, for all of you out there, this was considered a lost film. This was considered a lost film, certainly in my childhood. And then, and I wish Stan was here to tell us about how it was unearthed. I would like to give him that microphone, but it was ultimately unearthed. This version that we're going to post is an HD version put up by the Library of Congress. This restoration and color tinting and so forth. So if you've never seen it, it's only about 13 minutes long, I think. It is well worth seeing this version of mine. And oddly, for a film cut down to this length, it got to a certain essence, which is very powerful, I think. Stan, do you want to tell us about how the Edison Frankenstein went from lost to found?
Oh, hopefully you'll be able to hear me. Can you hear me about that?
If you want to lean in a little closer to the microphone, that'll be good.
Okay, I'll lean.
There you
go. By a man named Al Detlaff, a gentleman who found the film in 35 millimeter, the only surviving print, and held it pretty much for ransom for the rest of his life. He thought it was worth a king's ransom, would not let it out, not let it be seen, and when it was seen, they had to pay him and his family an exorbitant amount of money. And when he passed away, unfortunately, he died and no one found his body right away. And he was decomposing near his film collection. And this film was so close to his bed, it almost decomposed with him.
Wait. Now, are you saying a weird, greedy collector like that will likely die alone? I mean, how can that happen? How can that happen?
Anyway,
everybody loves weasels like that.
I was so incensed that happened that when I had and I'm sorry I don't have the setup to show you. I own a 16 millimeter print of the 1910 Frankenstein, and when I got it, I went outside and held it up like it was that scene in Roots, and I held it up to the sky, and I said, "Fuck you, Al Detlaff."
How long was it known that he had it before he actually let people see it? Like, how many years elapsed before someone like you knew about it and you could actually lay eyes on it?
Well, we knew that he had it in the 70s, and sometime in the 80s, he would go to certain, I believe some company wined and dined him and his family. They put him up in a motel for 3 days. He was going to show the film at a festival. He came dressed in a toga and walked down the theater aisle and created this whole spectacle. And apparently he trashed the hotel room with his family. And no one could ever get the film. He made a ersatz VHS with his name all over it, so you could hardly see the image. And he held on to it. And the only reason we have it is relatives went into his home weeks after he died and had already been decaying into the floor beds of his room. And that's when they knew something was wrong with the ceiling, that he was actually decomposing into his house. And people from, I think, UCLA went in there and were able to get the stuff, make a negotiation with his family, and then they were able to do a restoration. Wow. Thankfully, we do get to see it, even with its primitive look, the reverse motion for special effects. But I find it very effective considering now it's 110 years old And quite frankly, that is the first version of
Yeah.
Frankenstein.
It's actually one of the most effective films besides the Melies films that have. Stan, can you mute yourself at the moment? It's getting a lot of noise there. It's one of the most effective use of pure proscenium shooting that we find, I think, in that era, because they actually use that frame interestingly. He puts the glass, the reflection up on the right of the image. And so it's actually fairly effective for something that does not have much depth to the physical image. Speaking of not much depth to the physical image, we could talk forever here. I've had a wonderful show here with you guys. I think, Billy, this is a tremendous inaugural episode of a century of horror. Bringing us up to 1929. We skimmed the surface, but what we hope is you at home have gotten interested to skim a little more. And in our description of the show that will always live underneath where this is posted on YouTube at the POPXP, make sure that you like and subscribe to POPXP. You will see the links, and I have scoured all through YouTube to find the best, in most cases, HD links to uploaded horror, and I encourage you to make yourself a little mini horror film festival. I encourage you to watch it on big screens. These are not meant to be watched on your phones or your iPads or distracted on your desktop while you are on Facebook. These were meant to be seen large. That's why often people are small in the frame. Try to give yourself that gift of turning the lights down, wire YouTube to your TV if it isn't already wired to your TV, and try to watch these films and let them run over you. They were made for a time when people didn't have as many media distractions as they do today. So give yourself that chance. You'll see there are a lot of gems and a lot of riches to be had. So quickly, let's just everyone just let me know what you are all up to, so people can continue to follow all of you who are on this panel. Let's start with Brian, and then what are you up to, and where can people find you?
Real quick, I'm running a Kickstarter for my latest Lady Death, Treacherous Infamy, the 12th chapter in Lady Death's undead life at Coffin Comics. You want to find out more? Go to coffincomics.com. Thank you so much, everybody.
And Graham?
I'm working on my horror comic, The Chenoo, which is also on Indiegogo. It's in demand right now, and it's the first out of the gate under my publishing company, Compass Comics.
Terrific. Justin, how about yourself?
Well, I'm going to be contributing a bunch of stuff to Centipede Press's making of book on Toby Hooper's Salem's Lot. And I'm finishing up George Pal Man of Tomorrow. There's a Facebook page, but there is a fake Facebook page that some useless weasel put up. It has 50 followers. Mine has 450 followers. Go to the one with 450 followers that looks like it was put up by a sentient human being.
Yes, that's George Pal Man of Tomorrow. Perry, will we be seeing? When will Monsterpalooza? When will conventions happen again?
Well, we're scheduled for April of 2021 in Pasadena. We canceled both of them this year, Monsterpalooza and Son of Monsterpalooza, which would have been in about a month. So hopefully we'll be back in April.
Yeah. Wonderful. Now, Stan, of course, you have coming up your Cinecon.org. We should go on there, and we should see all the riches that you have. And he just ran away. He was so terrified. I will say, I myself published in October of last year, Stoker and Wells, courtesy of a wonderful group of backers on Kickstarter. We got tremendous reviews all across the comic book media. LA Weekly ran an article on us, which is unheard of. And now, with Billy's encouragement, I have it now up on Indiegogo in a pre-campaign phase. We're going to sell the already printed book on Indiegogo with all new perks that have never been seen before. So please go to Indiegogo, look up my name, look up Stoker and Wells, and add your name to the email list, and you'll be kept aware, because a lot of these perks are limited in number, so you want to be the first to find out. Billy, tell us, why don't you close us out on what you're up to, sir?
Yeah, I just want to thank all this illustrious panel.
Can you mute yourself, Stan? Thanks.
Stan, I apologize that you joined. I'm sorry you joined us a little late, but we're looking forward to seeing to the 1930s and the first talkie horror films. I just want to say what a privilege this is. I've learned so much. I've had so much fun. I must apologize. My PC died on me the other day, and I'm taking my MacBook Pro and kind of rigging up a little, I don't know what sort of a little, I got a little satellite thing going on, and I want to thank my partner Niall Scala, the CEO of POPXP, who came in, blew off a date night with his beautiful wife Farah to do this. I don't know what kind of trouble he's going to get in. But I just want to say I want to thank you guys for joining us, especially the two, all of us, of course, but Brian Polito and Graham Nolan, two giants of the industry. These are amongst the most talented yet humble men that you'll ever meet. They've got gangbuster campaigns going on right now. Both of these guys have been a huge influence on me. We came together and became friends due to our love of horror films and cinema in general. And it was a night after a convention, a post-con night. And Stephen, you've been privy to some of these at San Diego Comic-Con, of course. And when some wine is flowing, or a little bit of beer and scotch, and then all of a sudden you learn all these wonderful things about one another, and these conversations end up going on until 4 a.m. in the morning. And we can talk forever about cinema. We can talk forever about horror films, which I think is a catalyst that brought us all together. Because what I love about horror, and I think all of us will attest to it, is that unlike the silent film, how it started with the silent films with the star system, you got to see that new John Gilbert film, you got to see that new Cary Grant film, the Gary Cooper film. The horror films were the stars. And again, we can talk about Lon Chaney. I don't know how many people knew who Lon Chaney's name was. I'm sure they did. I don't know if you knew like we do Lon Chaney. But I love the idea of horror films, that kind of film still to this day. These low-budget horror films could be amongst the top 10 grossing films or top 5 grossing films of the years with nobodies or these young kids or things like that. And I just love this joy and this wonderment of horror. And I hope you all will join us as we move into the talkies. I love going from this arty stage of again, every frame looks like a painting, this mobile camera, and then we start to go into this almost, again, as Justin had mentioned earlier, with these massive, sound equipment, and films get a little bit stagnant. You look at the jazz singer, but then again, you look at how horror starts picking up. You look at when Browning comes in, and James Whale, and these wonderful films going forward into the 1930s, and how it really changed. It really turned a page in history, and influences that as someone as a comic book creator, how it completely inspired me. And again, as someone like Brian Polito, a filmmaker in his own right, and Graham Nolan and Stephen Perros and just Perry. What a wonderful experience. And I'm looking forward to going to next month when we come into the 1930s. And I just want to thank you guys. This was just wonderful. Yes, I have a campaign now. We are now in fulfillment for our She, my co-writer Stephen Perros right here. It's been a joy to work with you. We're in fulfillment now. It's the first new She comic in 15 years. We totally I think it's amazing from 6 months ago, Steve, what our She comic was to rewriting and redrawing and writing 25 pages and recoloring, and I think we delivered a wonderful product.
Billy, I have to say, Billy's pencils are extraordinary, and his love of cinema is apparent in it. And we worked in total serendipity. There was no, I would write, Billy would write and create panels, and I was like, what? I know Billy, but I'm working with his sacred character. Will he be okay with that? And he was just the best creator to work with. It's like writing this Yakuza crime fusion Yakuza film noir ghost story. It's been a real blast, and we moved right into the sequel, which we're already many pages. We're nearly 20 pages into already, which is JEKYLL. So it's been a lot of fun, Billy, and it's been a lot of fun being with all you. Thank you, everybody at home. Please,
a great pleasure. Good meeting you all.
Real quick, if I may, and it's good to see Stan is back. But I want to thank you, Brian, for giving me the confidence of of going forward as both of us had come up from the ranks as these small indie creators, and you're a control fiend, you know, you're just, and then like you meet someone, you know what I mean, who's a writer, and you meet someone else who comes in with a new perspective on your character that you've nurtured and you've had for 25, 30 years, and just to come in to have a whole new fresh perspective coming in, and to kind of letting that baby go for a bit, you know, like, what do you think? And then all of a sudden, it's just magic. And it's just like magic, like cinema. And again, I think this panel was a lot like, we're like the trailblazers of early cinema, you know, and we kind of learned as we went along. And I thank you all for coming. And I know Friday night's a huge night, live streaming. But again, like most of our POPXP shows, it's always coming on in you know, people will visit it later on over the weekend and stuff. And I just want to thank you. I want to thank you, especially you, Brian, especially you, Stephen, Perry. Wow. Justin, I'm just astonished by the knowledge, the inspiration of film. And I love this. I just, what a wonderful experience. Of course, Graham, always one of my confidants in creativity. I love you guys. I love that Graham's like, well, I'm not a really big fan of silent horror films. And I'm going to go Graham tonight, talking for 2 more hours about this. Because
on that note, thank you, everyone. Please keep an eye out and share. We will be doing this monthly. End of September, we'll be doing A Century of Horror 1930s.
That's my wheelhouse.
There we go. We'll come back.
Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure. Good meeting you all.
Thank you,
everybody. Have a great weekend.
Very nice meeting you guys. Peace out.
Thank you so much.
Have a great night, fellas.
Okay, thank you.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on POPXP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the POPXP and over on Instagram at the POPXP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.